So right now we're standing in the middle of Covington Station's platform area. It's about 35 to 40 yards long. If you look behind me, you can see one of the platform entrances. So you can see the steps here that would lead to the platform. So you would enter in behind where I'm standing from the main waiting rooms. You would come down this hallway and you would enter the platforms. There's one directly to my right and one directly to my left. One would be heading north, so trains heading north, you would go up one set of stairs. One set of stairs led to trains heading south. This was a very busy station, particularly before and during World War II. Lots of people coming into the station to travel, either on business or for pleasure or visiting family. And so this was a very bustling station. The Covington Station connected people traveling both north and south. And so it was a major transportation hub in our area and was heavily used. If you look here on the walls, you can still see some of the original paint that is left in the train station. This would have been a very nice concourse when it was originally constructed. So it would have been a way to show off the city. The train station was the way many people first experienced Covington. So when they came to Covington, they got off a train in this location. And so they wanted to build a station and platforms and all the amenities that showed off how Covington had advanced. And Covington was reaching the height of its population when this building was built. So in the 1920s, Covington was really hopping, and there was lots going on in the community, lots of construction. And so this was a way of showcasing the wealth and the status of Covington in our region. So I'm standing in the middle of the concourse of Covington Station. So this is how you would enter after you left the waiting room to catch your train. So to my right is the station, and you would walk out the main doors and you would walk into this area to catch your train. Behind me is the concourse entrance, both to my right and to my left. So if you look up into the stairwell, you'll see we're actually going about 2.5 stories, so at least 25 to 30 steps that you're taking to walk from the lower level up to the platforms. One of the platforms you would catch trains going north, and one of the platforms you would catch trains going south. And if you look, you can see that this building was really built to showcase Covington as a city. It would have been a very busy station. The size of this concourse is considerable. It's about 35 yards. And so it's a large station that would have been jam-packed with people in the 20s, the 30s, and certainly during the war era. But you can see some of the original paint is still on the wall, so you can see how they did the stripe effect. There would have been posters along these walls, especially during World War II, that would have been promoting the war effort to buy victory bonds. So this station really shows the history of Covington. And it was really important for the city fathers and for those working in the city and the railroad to showcase Covington. Covington was reaching the peak of its population in the 1930s, 1920s. There would have been almost 60,000 people living in the city at that time period. And so lots of people were coming through Covington. And this is where, if you were traveling to Covington, this is where you got your first taste of the city. So the owners of the station, the railroad, really put a lot of money, a lot of effort into making sure that this was a great first impression. And there were hundreds of people getting off trains here every time a train pulled in, and thousands of people coming through the station every day. So this is a very busy place. And so they wanted to make sure that when you got off a train here that you saw the importance of Covington and how Covington was moving up in the world and the importance of the economy in Covington. And so there would have been a lot of promotional materials in this building and in the concourse, explaining, what you could do in Covington and what amenities were available. There would have been lots of hustle and bustle going on in this area of people getting on and off trains. So this was a really busy part of Covington, a really busy station that was connecting people north, south, east, and west through this little piece of history that's still standing in Covington that we're so fortunate to have left. As you can see, when the train station was no longer used, a lot of the concourse was used for fill. So you'll see lots of fill has been put into these concourses, but you can still see the original steps. You can still see where you're reaching you can see the sunlight coming through where the platform is. And so it's a really great slice of history to show how transportation evolved in northern Kentucky, especially in Covington, and how important this station was to our region. So ironically, when this building was built, cars were in their infancy. So cars were, becoming more popular, but very few families owned a car in the 1920s. And so rail travel was still a very typical way for people to get from one place to the other. But cars were developing very quickly. They were becoming cheaper as they were being mass produced. They were also becoming much more reliable. And so, travel by car became a way that was affordable and dependable and reliable. And so many families were buying cars and using them for travel. By the 1950s, cars had become the major mode of transportation for Americans across the country.
You're either coming to Covington or you're leaving from Covington. And how many people are coming here? Well, you got Ludlow and Bromley coming over. But as you go south of here, there's a station at Latonia. There's a station at Newport. I need to stand and say one thing. If it's a limited train, then it's coming from Cincinnati, maybe Covington, coming to Covington, and its next stop may be Lexington. It's the milk train where it's stopping at every station. Called a milk train because they used to stop at every station to pick up the milk cans or drop the milk cans off. It's a different story. Newport, yes, when I was a kid, I wasn't the only person that hung out down at the depot to see who was arriving and leaving, which was a big thing in those days. But Newport, you're at track level. Here you're not at track level, so you can't see the train coming in. You're most probably going to go to Latonia to hang out at the track, or to Erlanger to hang out, or to Newport to hang out.
So in its heyday, was this close enough to the Pike Street corridor with all the shopping, or if you wanted to get a drink or a steak before a long train ride, you can walk from here?
You can walk over to Pike Street. Yeah, that is part of the deal with some of these stations that they were put in, but the understanding is, I don't even think they had a newsroom in here. You were supposed to go to the local stores, get your newspaper, your magazines, your food, your soft drinks, your sandwiches, and take them along, unless the train had a diner on. The milk trains don't have diners, they got a butcher boy. The butcher boy goes around with a box in front of him, hanging off, selling sandwiches, magazines, candy bars, and things like that. So you have that on board the train.
So you figured that in its heyday, I mean, there was tens of thousands of people coming through here on any...
Yeah. And when it was first built, you're running, I imagine, over 100,000 people a year through here. By 1971, maybe 1,000 people per year at the most, if you're even moving that many through, because everybody's going out to Greater Cincinnati Airport. I'm sorry, the Northern Kentucky Cincinnati International Airport, and taking the plane, or they're driving. You're not using the passenger train anymore. Passenger business is just falling off. As I said, once the head end is moving mail and packages is gone, you don't need passenger trains because nobody's riding them.
So last question for you. I know that you're into trains, and I know that you were here in your youth. What's it feel like to be in a structure that you remember from so long ago and seeing it like it is now?
It is depressing to think that this was the heart of Covington.
Okay, step this way for me. The sun's creeping up on you.
It's depressing to be here to think that when I was a kid, this was the heart of Covington. This is where everybody came to see who was coming and leaving. Of course, everybody slowly migrates out to the Greater Cincinnati Airport. Yeah, we did that the same thing. There used to be a place to park out at the Greater Cincinnati Airport. And you go out on Sunday and there'd be hundreds of cars sitting there. People just sitting in their cars watching the planes land and take off, which was a big thing. DC-3s, DC-4s, 6s. Martin 404s, conveyors. Anyway, that was the big thing. You no longer went down the train station and watched the trains, although I still went down to watch the train. But 99.9% of the people didn't come to watch trains anymore and went to the airport to watch planes take off and leave.
When Covington Station was operating, there were covered platforms. When I say covered, they had a little bit of a roof overhang to keep you out of the rain, the snow to some degree. There'd be lighting, so at night you come up here and there'd be, it wouldn't be dark. You would have baggage carts and railroad employees coming and going a little bit to make sure your baggage got on. And this would be going all day and all night. It wasn't like you had one train going through here a day. You would have multiple, both locals and standard trains, which were, they made stops at almost every station, and then your more first-class trains that only stopped at the really big cities. And Covington was a big city, and they got most every train stopped here, and so that.
So is there any way to tell how many cars were in each train? And
absolutely.
Was there more freight? Was there more people?
There was always, so.
Did they make more money off freight? Did they
hold on, yeah, yes,
okay.
they did. Give me a second here.
Sure.
So railroads were always, in the original, when railroads started, carrying people was a major emphasis. But freight always paid the bills. It did then, it still does. Depending on the era, you have passenger revenue made up a greater impact in pre-automobile and even after the automobile into the 20s and 30s. By the time you're getting into the 1940s, the automobile is starting to take over, planes are around, and that passenger revenue is really going down. Freight trains always paid the bills. There were always more freight trains in some areas, and in this area that would be true. Talk about freight. It used to be that the Louisville and Nashville, and especially, which would run trains north through here and south, but north would be loaded coal trains to feed power plants, industries. Most of that's all gone, and even the coal trains they go a different direction now because of market changes. But every commodity that you could think of always traveled the rails. They call it less than carload freight. So if you wanted to send a big box of something somewhere, whether you were a business or private person, it went on the train to a different freight terminal. This being a passenger terminal, there were plenty of trains, when it was once it got up to the 1950s and 60s, and when Amtrak came around in the 1970s, you had very few trains, 1, 2 a day, but in the heyday you had 10, 20 trains, depends on what exact era you're looking at. And you could always, and there were these things called timetables, passenger timetables that people had, and you could tell exactly what amenities the train had, whether it had a sleeping car, whether it had several sleeping cars, if it had a lounge, if it had other special services which were advertised. You could, the dining car was open most of the time up until late in the evening, and if you wanted to get something to eat, you could go there. At a certain point they closed. They probably give you a sandwich if you really wanted something for your overnight hours. But and there would also be cafes at most big stations, and you would have a chance to get something fresh off the train. Which, just like when you're on a plane, everybody wants to eat when they get off the train, because that's even better. But the fare that was on dining cars, first class dining, was white linen tablecloth service for if you wanted that first class dining car service, and full-blown meal on china. People still collect railroad china. It often has monograms, imprints, and be silverware, and you're riding along the train and eating a steak, eating bacon and eggs, or whatever you could imagine goose, duck, any kind of meal, because they would have chefs on the train to cook you a meal to pretty much your specifications. Or there was usually a menu, and so there was always a menu. There was always a menu. You can still find those out there, collectibles, and of what train offered what. And there were some trains that didn't have a dining car. That'd be more of a common carrier passenger train that it was going to be essentially the local to go a couple hundred miles and stop at every little place and also pick up the mail. That's the one thing that a lot of people don't realize, that the passenger trains were also primarily picking up, carrying mail a lot of times. They would use a mail hook system at smaller stations, but in Covington, no, they'd load the mail right on. And that's how your U.S. mail got to most places, because it went on the train. There's no doubt that famous people, especially the presidential visits, are most remembered. FDR campaign stops right off the back of the train, and now the thing is those was called whistle stop tour, and they would get way from the back of the train. Now in Covington, probably in Covington, you certainly had some whistle stop things, but Covington was a large enough city that typically they'd probably get off and do a speech down at the foot of the station. So for a town as big as Covington, that would probably be the case, that most of the times that happened if they were going to stop. Now, there's plenty of times that famous people, presidents, etc., just kept going through because they were on their way somewhere else, because this is a transportation network.
So Pullman was a company that serviced not only the United States, but they were big into building cars for the Germans and all over Europe. So talk about that a little bit, about how this is not just a business that is landlocked. You're talking about trains are used primarily all over the world. They were big time. That was their heyday, right?
Right. Well, and I would argue, in some ways, the heyday around the world is even right now. For the U.S., that's a lot of freight, but it's also a lot of passenger activity in the not only the Northeast, but in California, in Florida. There's lots of efficient, fast passenger service in Europe, where there was a lot more investment in high-speed rail. We still see a very robust passenger system across Europe, but every continent, most every country still has rail service. My point of view personally is that for when it comes to freight, especially, that the freight railroads will go away when Captain James T. Kirk can beam some cargo up somewhere, because it can't all fit on planes efficiently for fuel, and the rail network takes thousands, millions of trucks off the road every year, tractor trailers. So, and we already know how congested highways can be at times. But as far as the Pullman company goes, the Pullman was a national brand, and they were based out of Chicago. They also had a plant in Ludlow, Kentucky, just a few miles to our west. There was a very famous Pullman strike at one point where workers struck for better wages, and that caused some extreme labor strife in Ludlow and in Chicago. But right now, Pullman's factories are a national landmark run by National Park Service that they just opened up in August. They built cars for places around the nation. They were not the only passenger car builder, and they built what were more considered regular cars that that were pretty just nice, and then they built ornate cars that were for the upper echelon of society, people who could afford it, and railroads that wanted to have those special cars for their special guests. And so the railroads had something, and still do, had something for passengers that for every walk of life. Everybody took the train because that was the best way and most efficient way to go. Now we know that most people primarily travel by auto or rail now, but most people travel by auto or airplane now. Most people travel by auto or airlines now, but there's still a place for the rails, and when it comes to passenger, it depends on where you are in the nation, but in Covington and in Cincinnati, the Amtrak train stops that goes between Chicago and Washington, D.C. via Cincinnati. It's called the Cardinal, and it stops at Cincinnati, no longer stops at Covington, and it goes through in the pre-dawn hours, usually around 4 or 5, maybe 6 or 7 in the morning, on its way between Washington, D.C. and Chicago. And there's always lots of talk in the news now about expanding Amtrak service, and so you never know when that might change. But what you also have to realize is the freight railroads are pretty busy, and so these tracks that are next to us, they're busy. They have quite a few trains going by a day. How many varies. You could have 10 a day, and you could have 30 in a day. And so, and each train can be, these days, up to 10,000 feet long.